One thing that AI allows us to do is to engage in scientific discovery. So for instance, there's people at Google DeepMind who are using AI to fold proteins to figure out, to try to discover potential ways of folding proteins such that we can cure diseases with it, something along those lines. It's very interesting. It's amazing that we can use AI to do this kind of thing because it's not, if you like, necessarily a person thinking of some hypothesis about, hey, maybe if we fold the proteins this way and that's going to do something. It's letting the AI sort of run through all the options to see if it could hit upon a plausible solution. And this brings us to the issue of what does scientific discovery look like and what should it look like in the age of AI? This is what I talk about with my guest today. His name is Ramón Alvarado. He's a professor of philosophy, specializing in, among other things, the philosophy of science at the University of Oregon. And he's really interested in thinking about the ways in which, to put it broadly, humanity should have a role to play in scientific discovery, that we shouldn't just give it over to the AI, and that maybe we're not quite in danger of giving it over to the AI completely, but we are in danger of letting AI and other technologies engage in scientific discovery in a way that begins to crowd out the essentially human element that we ought to have in scientific discovery. Okay, there are actually 3 claims that I want to draw out to your attention, because the conversation is wide-ranging, and there's 3 different claims, at least 3 different claims that Ramón raises and that we discuss, that it's good for you to keep track of as we listen. The first is a straight-up empirical claim. It's the claim that what Ramón calls serendipity, is happenstance, that we stumble upon a solution. A famous example is Alexander Fleming finding penicillin in a petri dish that he left out while he was on vacation. He comes back from vacation and finds penicillin. It's more complicated than that, of course, but a lot of luck, serendipity, played a role in the finding of the discovery of penicillin and thus antibiotics. So the empirical claim is that serendipity plays a necessary role in scientific discovery, that there's something about serendipity that cannot be replaced by AI or any other kind of technology. That's a rather robust claim. I'm not sure I'm convinced of it, but it's out there. It's a claim that we discuss and it's worth considering. So that's empirical claim number 1. We can't make certain discoveries without serendipity. Okay, the second big claim that we discuss is half empirical, half epistemic claim. Epistemic claims are about knowledge, what we know. So here's the other claim. It's not that AI literally cannot do what serendipity does. It's rather that serendipity is another significant arrow in the quiver of scientific discovery, that it might not be absolutely necessary, but, and here's a sort of normative claim if you like, it plays enough of a role such that we ought not to lose sight of it, such that we ought to make sure that we don't deprioritize it. So that's another claim. Again, it's not that it's necessary, it's just that it plays a sufficiently large causal role in scientific discovery, such that we better not deprioritize it. The third and final claim that we talk about is, I think, a straight up ethical claim. And it's something like this. It's that there's something ethically valuable about humans engaged in the process of scientific discovery, that those acts or those occurrences of serendipity that humans, if you like, fall into in the course of their lives, overhearing a conversation, reading a book and a certain quote popping out and having a eureka moment, that there's something that's ethically valuable about that. And we sacrifice that ethical value, or we sacrifice that practice, that ethically valuable practice, if we give over too much of our control to the AI. So again, 3 main claims. AI can't replace serendipity. Number 2, maybe it can, but it plays a large enough role such that we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of it. And number 3 is that there's something ethically valuable about the serendipitous discoveries by people. At the core of all this, if you want to put it a little bit dramatically, at the core of all this is the question, what role does and should our imperfect, accidental humanity play in scientific discovery? Okay, that's what this episode is about. I am your host, Reed Blackman. This is Ethical Machines. If you're one of the many people who's listening to this on a mobile browser, please don't forget to go over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is and subscribe so that you can get future episodes. You might also want to head over to my Substack, reedblackman.substack.com, where I do a lot of writing on ethics and tech. You can email me with comments, thoughts, trenchant criticisms at em@reedblackman.com. And that's enough about me. Let's go talk to Ramón. So, Ramón, you've got this concern that I haven't heard before and that I'm fascinated or intrigued by. It's that there's problems with what you've called automating science. AI automates science, and there are certain gaps that are left out when we do that. So I want to know what that means. What does it mean to automate science? I have in mind things like Google DeepMind and protein folding. I'm not sure if that's what you have in mind. So what is it to automate science? And then we can get into what are we leaving out when we automate it?
Now, just very quickly, there's a distinction in philosophy of science that is, you have the context of discovery, like how do we discover stuff? And then you have the context of justification, how we justify what we found as reliable. Those two are usually seen as different contexts. And some people say the latter, justifying our results, that can be more or less automated because we have procedures for that. We know how science works. We know what steps ought to be taken. If we can just build a machine that takes those kinds of steps, or several machines that do that work for us, then we can automate that part. What wasn't so clear was whether we could automate discovery. Because here's the thing. Discovery comes in all kinds of forms, right? You may have a dream at night and then wake up and say, oh, eureka, I got the solution, right? Or some crazy person talks to you in the corner and then again, eureka, you get a discovery. Or like we did with penicillin, right? You're looking for something else, but you left your little thing outside and suddenly you get this new bacteria, it's penicillin, right? Or something like that. And so the idea was like, you don't automate discovery. That's the one thing that discovery can come from all over the place. Now with AI, it seems that at the very least, that may be one of the things that we're getting closer to automating. The idea that you can test hypotheses, a myriad of hypotheses, and you can even automate just discovery. That happened with protein folding, right? Try 100,000 different ways of folding a protein and see which out of these 100,000, which 10 seem the most viable. Give it back as a result to the researcher, and then the researcher, instead of having to wait 3 years to test 100 hypotheses or 100,000 hypotheses, which is impossible for a researcher, they can just work with these 10 that the machine already deemed viable or plausible, right? And so in one sense, we've automating a little bit of discovery.
Let me take a step back and see if I understand what this means. So there's a number of things, I'm going to put this sort of, maybe not quite the right way, but there's lots of things that computers can do. It can run, one thing is I can do math, right? They've got calculators, or they are calculators. And so it can solve complex mathematical issues for us. Okay, that's fine. It can also run simulations, I take it. Or it can model things or create models of things and then play out. Given the model, it can predict how things are going to unfold given such and such variables. I don't know. You might model the weather. If you're a meteorologist, you might model the weather and use the automated ways of predicting whether it's going to rain on Thursday or whatever. I imagine that you can do certain kinds of simulations with, I don't know, combining versus certain chemicals together or something along those lines, or biological material. Or I imagine that if you're trying to figure out what kinds of new materials, new physical materials for construction, you might run certain kinds of simulations or something like that.
Yeah.
Let's simulate a bridge. Is the bridge going to collapse with such and such a weight on it? And you might turn to, okay, that all seems, I don't know, fairly innocuous. Right? This discovery thing, yes, there's the eureka thing, but there's also just trying different things out. And if the computer, the AI in particular, can run different kinds of scenarios and find different kinds of potential solutions for a problem, you can call that discovery. All right, cool. So I say, okay, that's great. But you're worried about this sort of thing, and you think that this leaves something out. And I guess it just seems to me like what you're saying is that there's these tools. They help us a great deal in scientific inquiry. What could be the concern be, other than, of course, things like the tool doesn't work?
Some philosophers of science have begun to write papers that say, hey, you know what? It's okay. Not only is it okay to use AI in science, it actually turns out that it works fine, right? And we should actually trust its results. This hypothesis testing, blah, blah, blah. For example, Emily Sullivan has a paper that says we can use these things as toy models. They're not full scientific models, but they're toy models. And we, like you said, we can play around with them and do stuff with them. There's Eamon Dude, who wrote another paper that says, like, not only are they like toy models, we can actually trust some of these stuff seriously because they can do all kinds of interesting things that we don't have the time for, etc. And so they are saying, guess what? My big argument is that it's okay to use this in the context of discovery of science. Now, the problem for me as a philosopher is the following. That's not too much of an argument, right? Because guess what? As we said earlier, all kinds of things go in the context of discovery. If I have a dream, a crazy dream at night that suddenly gives me the eureka moment, that's valid, right? If I just hear some crazy person in the corner saying something outlandish, but that again gives me an eureka moment, that's valid. So in the context of discovery, all of those things are valid. A magic 8-ball is valid. So when somebody makes the argument that, hey, AI is valid to use in this context, for me it's like, yeah, so are dreams, so are 8-balls. So you're not really telling me much about the strength of this thing, except that it's okay, it's a nice little gadget to test stuff. Just, okay, so that's one part, right? That as an argument itself in epistemology of science, it doesn't have it doesn't really say much relevant because anything goes in the context of discovery. Now, the other...
Wait, so hold on. Before you get to the other part, just put a bookmark in the other part. I'm not sure that... Suppose the claim is not AI can play some role in scientific discovery. I take it... Because if the bar for what counts as being able to make a contribution to scientific discovery, if that bar is so low such that the 8-ball, a magic 8-ball is included, or what a crazy person mutters in a corner that you happen over here, if that counts as valid forms of discovery, then yes, of course, the claim that AI passes that bar, that's who gives a shit. Okay. But I take it the claim must be way more robust than that. I take it that the interesting claim is something like AI can play a massive role in how we do discovery, such that you wouldn't build a scientific discovery program around the behaviors of magic 8-balls or crazy people, but you may well think that you can build a scientific program around the tool that is AI, or the suite of tools that are AI enabled or whatever. Suppose it's that more robust claim, not that it can be used, but that it can be used, it should be used, it can and will play, maybe should play an outsized role in how we do scientific inquiry and discovery in particular. That seems like a more robust empirical claim that's worth contending with, no?
There is something in automation, especially with AI, when we automate procedures, that just puts things on rails. And while some things are meant to be on rails, and there's all kinds of benefits to being on rails, once you put it on rails, there's all kinds of things around it that you'll be missing as you go forth from point A to point B, right? And one of the things that I stumbled upon was this idea of serendipity in discovery. Right? There's a lot of weird things that we weren't even looking for that we find.
Sure.
And when we automate discovery, I think one of the things that we're leaving out is the possibility of serendipity. And now I thought I was on my own thinking about values and thinking about this lofty thing called serendipity that I want to protect because I'm a romantic and I read Kurt Vonnegut and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then I realized, no, there's a whole literature about the role of serendipity in science. Right? Serendipity in scientific discovery, serendipity in scientific progress, etc. And so I'm right now, as I'm writing about this, I'm realizing I called it epistemic serendipity because it's the idea that good things can happen to our knowledge from places that we cannot even foresee, right? But again, luckily, I'm not on my own. So once you start, as a scholar does, looking through the terms and Google Scholar or other places, you find, oh my God, there's 30 years or at least 25 years of conversation on the idea that there's such things, not just epistemic serendipity, is scientific serendipity or the role of serendipity in science. And so that's where I'm thinking, that's one of the things that we'll be missing when we automate a lot of these processes. So yeah, hypothesis testing is great when you already have a range of the possible hypotheses that you want to explore in the first place. But a lot of the times we don't, right? And a lot of the really big leaps in science, let's say going back to Kuhn, who said the structure of scientific revolutions in 1963, he says most of science is normal. People go to the lab, they do exactly what their advisor tells them. They try to corroborate something that was already done, maybe advanced it a little bit, but they're all within the same paradigm. They're all following the same procedure, blah, blah, blah. Not normal, right? Revolutionary science happens sometimes when you're not even expecting it. And so then I'm afraid that by automating certain aspects of scientific discovery, we might be leaving out the possibility of serendipity. and especially
All right, so
episteme. Yeah, go ahead. So please push back or give me your thoughts.
it's not unreasonable. So there's a couple of strands of thoughts here. So one is, it might be the case that I'm sure it has been the case that serendipity has played a role in various scientific discoveries. Number one, I could see someone saying, look, one thing that we're trying to do is decrease the reliance on serendipity to come to major scientific conclusions. So if there's I don't know how many tens of thousands of ways are there to fold proteins, millions. I don't know how many different ways there are, but there's lots of ways to fold proteins, which apparently is important for things like drug discovery. And suppose I say, what we've got now is like a kind of random guess as to which proteins we should try folding up and seeing what happens. But we don't want to have to rely on, luckily, figuring out which protein to fold this way versus that way. And so if we could use AI to decrease serendipity, that's a good thing. That's one thing to say. The second major response, I would think, is something like, look, the claim is that AI can be a massive help in scientific discovery or inquiry more generally. It's not the only thing. It's a powerful tool. It's worth shaping a set of practices let's say a set of practices around it. And we should use it to the best of our ability. And it would be foolish to think that AI will provide all the answers. And it'd be foolish to literally ignore someone who had a great idea in the shower. But we're not talking about that. We're not talking about precluding other forms of discovery. Not in all cases anyway. We're at least talking about augmenting forms of discovery with AI. And if something should pop up along spontaneously, unpredictably, in a non-AI related way, that's fine. We still allow it. So one is, let's decrease serendipity, and the other is, even if you don't decrease it, let 1,000 flowers bloom in the world of AI, in the world of scientific discovery.
So let me be clear. I'm not anti-AI here. I'm just being cautious about the arguments that we're using for its reliability and the places where we want it or shouldn't want it. And one of the things that we ought to think when we are thinking about places where we want it or wanted to develop is, don't forget, right? It's a bit of a conservative argument. I think it's called Chesterton's fence argument, right? Which is, look, before you remove certain things, make sure you know why they were put there in the first place. Because a lot of the times, especially with progressive arguments, we all fall into the ideas like, I don't know what this is here for anyway, so let's just take it out. And so for me, the cautionary tale is there's so much you discover on the way to discovery. So I hear this utterance by this random person in the corner. Okay, eureka moment, but from eureka to really fleshing it out in an experiment such that then I can do the process of justification, I also had to learn a lot of things. So think about the way that Galileo learned about the telescope, right? So gets a letter from a friend, hey, there's somebody in Holland that just put together this weird device. And Galileo's like, oh shit, I think I know how they did it, but that's because I have some theoretical background. So it says, don't send me one, even though recently we discovered letters that actually he may have seen one in between the letter and his own building in a Catholic church. Anyway, but he says, I'm just going to build one myself that now I know the principles of. Because the other person was just a craftsman. They just discovered it by accident. I want to rediscover it, but with more theoretical backgrounds. And what I want to say is that there's so many things that we discover on the way there that also help enrich the movement forth to justifying a reliance. And so I wouldn't want people, especially young researchers in chemistry or biology, to skip that grind, right? Because it's enriching. And it's slower, but it depends what you're looking at. And maybe this is where you and I differ a little bit philosophically, right? If you're looking at science as a problem-solving endeavor, then you solve the problem. That's what science is for. There we go. And guess what? I got a tool that can solve that problem faster. Use the tool. But if you see, like I do, science as an epistemic endeavor, which is, science solves problems, but it solves them in virtue of knowledge creation, then you're skipping the rich part, which is like the more knowledge. If you really want 1,000 flowers to bloom, then you're gonna need serendipity rather than rails. And so in that sense, for me, again, even when you want 1,000 flowers to bloom, and again, this is not saying you shouldn't use AI. It's just you should think carefully as to when, how, and why you're deciding to use AI.
So now this is me agreeing in spirit. And here's a line of thought that I want to push, that you're unnecessarily narrow in your identification of the problem. Because it doesn't sound to me like this is a scientific issue as such. It just sounds to me an issue with automation, whatever it is that you're automating. Let me give you another example. I was recently speaking at an event about education in the metaverse, and AI's role in that and things of that sort. And one of the things that I focused in on was, look, people don't really appreciate what it is to have a good learning experience. They were talking about the metaverse and having a good learning experience in the metaverse or whatever, automated, maybe with AI teachers, that sort of thing. And one of the things that I highlighted was there's so much that goes on in a learning environment that's not the transference of knowledge. Yes, there's a transference of knowledge, but there's your professor notices that you said something that made them think that you're interested in X and you didn't know that X was even a topic that you could look into, right? How many people, let's say in the world of philosophy, know that there's an entire literature on what constitutes justification of, say, a belief or something like that, let alone a scientific theory? Oh, there's different ways of thinking about justification? I didn't even know that was who the hell knew that was the thing? And maybe you just said offhandedly in class, what is justification anyway? Anyway, blah, 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 blah. But an attuned professor might say, Ramon or Reed, there's a whole thing about justification. That's a good question. You should, if you're interested, and I could point you in the direction of some stuff which might not come up, or just offhand comments that a professor makes. Anyway, this is my way of saying, if you automated, say, learning philosophy, such that you give them an AI teacher that automates the teaching of Aristotle or whatever, asks them quizzes, gives them quizzes and gives them grades their papers or their essays or whatever, there's something else in the educational experience that gets lost if you automate. There's a lot. The stuff that you gain from osmosis, from other students, and from just... And so this is just me saying, I like your point. I think the serendipity point, I'm not convinced serendipity is the right word, but who cares? But it's not. I think your point is there's a richness to all forms of engagements with the external world, with other people, that automation can't account for.
Yeah, and you're again just preaching back one of the things that I firmly believe, and this is I've mentioned Kurt Vonnegut earlier because he has this little interview I think with the New York Times where he says, look, my wife is always telling me, why in the world are you still going to the store to buy an envelope? You're a rich author. You can have a box sent to you online, right? You just buy the box. But if I bought the box, I wouldn't be able to say hi to the cashier. I wouldn't see that fire truck coming around. I wouldn't ask that girl, he's like, hey, what kind of dog is that? And for him, for me, it's like, this is dancing and we're a dancing species, right? So this is Vonnegut. And that's very beautiful. Of course, it's very romantic. But I also found that same sentiment in more formal settings. So Point, who kind of invented statistics and stuff like that, he says, look, part of what often solves, not just helps solve, but part of what often solves an equation, it's a consideration of beauty, a consideration that you hadn't even thought about in the formalities of the proof. Is just you think, what would make this equation more beautiful? And you do that, and boom, a solution comes about, right? So these are considerations that are not within the formal system. And so whether it's in education or in science, like I get all of that from my seminars. One of the reasons why I teach seminars is because there's some things I haven't thought about that just pushing it out there, like we're doing right now with conversation, I'm going to start thinking about, right? And so definitely with you, it does apply to a lot of automation that is not necessarily scientific. I am a little bit in the philosophy of science literature because of my work on computer simulations. And so that's one traction. But again, I also have these other considerations on ethics and AI, ethics and machine learning. And I think this sort of goes in that direction, right?
Yeah, no, that's all really helpful. I've sometimes talked about things like, do we just care about this is the sort of cliched way of putting it is, I guess this is not an epistemic point. This is more of a sort of ethical value point, but it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. We can say it's about both, but I think that's also another way of putting your point in. Is I know it's said as sort of cliched way, but that there's something about the richness of trying to get to the result that leads to a better result.
Yeah, definitely. And the idea here is that it's not just this romantic richness. That's why I really love finding that Poincaré quote, right? Because it's also about, first of all, it's not just helpful. In fact, sometimes it does solve the problem. These other considerations that you hadn't thought about, these considerations of beauty, considerations of mass, these accidents, right? But the other thing is that it's also, I don't know, it ought to be, again, I'm going to give you this little point about broadening ethics. And this idea is that we ought to be thinking about these things and how they affect our lives in general. not just in specific settings, not just in science, not just in my classroom, but even just in general, right? And automation, of course, is one of those gigantic issues in the world.
So here's a kind of question that I wouldn't have asked you if I hadn't left academia, which is something like, what's to be done about this? I think it's easy to say, this is shitty, or it would be really bad to not appropriately value and put in place serendipity, or whatever one wants to call it. And so we need that sort of thing. But what does it look like to actually make that happen? Because the prevailing winds are all against that, right? Everything is pushing towards AI and automation and digital this and data that. And you're talking about not that. So even if we narrow it back down to the scientific space, I guess the question is, do you have a sense of how we actually put such a thing into practice? Or is it just a sort of, maybe just is the wrong word, is it a culture shift that we need? But even then, the question becomes, how do we initiate or how do we create and sustain a culture shift in the scientific community? What do we do? Is there anything to be done?
Yeah, so there's two things, right, or two approaches that I take. One is, let's say, from the philosophy of science, and it's this idea that we underestimate how much philosophy of science actually plays out in real scientific inquiry, right? There's a lot that is drawn from scientists, especially PIs, principal investigators, on how to go about things. And a lot of the times they draw from philosophy of science. We can go back and say Bacon, for example. You cannot say that he's not a philosopher, but also you cannot say that he did not influence the way scientific procedures happen. That's one. But then think about the way Daniel Dennett put it, which was, there's no such thing as value-free science. What there is scientists that take these values as assumptions and pursue their science without really engaging with the fact that they have all these value-laden assumptions. So that's the idea, is that we underestimate how much even some of our literature in philosophy of science does affect scientific practice. Maybe not industrial practice, but a lot of the industry, especially in these technical fields, comes from academia, right? And so we do have these already maybe a theoretical or maybe a cultural shift that you're talking about, where scientists are in fact reading philosophy of science for ideas about Bayesian probabilities, for ideas about what counts as evidence, for ideas about how does the mind interact with the body, etc., to do robotics, all of those little things. Okay, so that's one. The other one is from philosophy of technology, which is a weird little place over here. It's actually quite big, but it's often neglected in Anglo-American analytic philosophy. And in philosophy of technology and ethics of technology, you got this perspective of these engineering products require design, and designers are enmeshed in society in such a way that they take all of these values, they take all of these ideas, and then they build the things that they want to build. And in that sense, we have a direct link from let's say, a theoretical framework of what we ought to be doing to the people that are developing these technologies, right? A lot of these designers, in fact, go to design school, and a lot of design schools have this sociological aspect to them where they're reading the Frankfurt School in cultural critique, where they're reading philosophy of science, and they're reading the Cyborg Manifesto. And so, again, these designers, the people that are actually going and developing some of these interfaces, etc., have a direct link. So that's just to respond to the idea, does any of these have an effect? And I think when you're in academia, I think it's inevitable that it does. But second, when you ask me, what ought we to do? I think conversations like this and programs like yours bring these ideas to the public in a sense that designers, engineers, technologists will be thinking about something else rather than just harm mitigation, rather than just how much money can I make, etc. Right? So there's that to do, this having of conversations, which might be this very Socratic ideal, if you will. But the other thing is that, let's say you're a corporation and you're actually thinking about, what does it have to do with me? You won't be able to deny that your designers have aims, have missions, have visions about the products that you're developing. And so you better be aware on how they play out with your own sort of corporate structure, etc. And what's going to happen is that you are already thinking at the design level that are really diligent about doing things by hand, about making sure the architects of the systems that they're building know it from scratch. And so this idea that everything is moving super fast, it's an industrial idea. But a lot of this in industry borrows from academia. So all of these people that end up at Amazon and end up over there, especially at the PhD level, right? Once you might be able to venture into a startup by quitting Stanford, but you won't be able to develop the product unless you hire all these PhDs, right? And it turns out that all of these PhDs have been working super slowly, really crafting the one little thing that has been there. And why are they doing that? Because their advisors have these missions and visions and values, and they really take this idea of ethics and or philosophy of engineering at heart, even if they're not very well versed in it.
So I actually think you have given something of a concrete suggestion, which is something like there needs to be real support of expertise, which one, culturally is not that in fashion at the moment. And I feel like knocking PhD programs, knocking academia is in style at the moment. And I think one thing that one could say is something like, look, you don't really understand that the experts, the PhDs and the professors, et cetera, their expertise and the ways in which they acquire that expertise lends itself to appreciating a whole range of values and ways of doing things that we really don't want to lose sight of, like spontaneity. And things trickle down from them, from those experts, through to their students, to the students who then become scientists or product developers or whatever it is, engineers, data scientists at big tech or something along those lines. And so I think that's an interesting, unexpected answer to here's how we do it. One thing we do is we make sure that sort of expertise is still valued and, frankly, financially supported.
Yeah, and put at the front, right? Because it's a model where you might be disincentivizing PhDs just in virtue of not putting it in front facing of your corporation, or at least putting their mission front facing, right? Again, this idea of the startup, the dropout startup, it's amazing. And I actually really appreciate that, because a lot of things come from ignorance. Punk came from ignorance. You see a lot of filmmakers that make amazing things because they don't know how to make films. And you can see as a salesman, and you can even see as a product developer above the strict lines of a PhD student. And so we really do need those people to be running the business.
There's also the sort of, maybe it's even aesthetic value. Like for the Kurt Vonnegut example, there's a kind of aesthetic value to a life lived in that sort of way. There's the value of, I don't know, the surprise of running into a neighbor that you didn't think that you hadn't seen in a long time. That's a certain spice to life or something like that. Seeing that neighbor wasn't a means to the end of getting something further. It was just like, it was so nice to run into that neighbor or something along those lines. So there's a normative claim, which is something like, if we automate too much, then we don't get the valuable stuff in life. There's a different claim, though, which is a more empirical claim. And this actually goes to your RA example of when we think about certain kinds of things like beauty and aesthetic value, it helps us to get better results. It's part and parcel of it. But now if I'm a dyed-in-the-wool data scientist, et cetera, I might say something like, look, yes, there's humans and there's serendipity and there's this and there's that and there are thoughts about beauty that plays a certain functional role in getting to the right result. And that's lovely. And it might be the case that if we introduce AI in a significant way and shape our scientific practices around it, AI becomes the foundation of our scientific inquiries, whatever that amounts to, then you are right that we will decrease the amount of serendipity and considerations of, say, beauty into the equation. And discoveries that we would have made had we had those things won't happen, or at least they'll happen at a lower rate. I'll stipulate. But we'll still have overall more impactful discoveries through AI. So yes, we will decrease serendipity-driven discoveries, but we'll increase overall the set of discoveries. And so is a sacrifice worth making, because you're just making an empirical claim that serendipity plays a causal role in making these discoveries. I'll concede it and tell you, but its impact isn't great enough, and it can be outrun by the impacts of AI.
Yeah, I think that in itself, it's an empirical question. The idea would be the following. How do we manage those trade-offs, because I can accept those two things, right? And then at every single point ask myself, am I willing to trade this off for that? In this setting right now, for let's say AI in the health industry, do I want beauty? First of all, let me just clarify, the idea with Poincaré wasn't just that it's nice to have, is that, well, sometimes without it, you wouldn't even get the solution, right? Without those considerations, or without, yeah, in that sense, the question here is going to be about trade-offs. And I acknowledge that both things could be true. AI, it does things that are better, and we're losing something. Now, we have to decide when, where, and why to use it to see whether that thing that we're losing is worth it. So I don't think it's just beauty, for example. I don't think it's just aesthetic. I think serendipity is an extra different value that is not just because it's pretty. In fact, serendipity doesn't always seem pretty. It's not always convenient either. So then there's this extra set of considerations that are not just aesthetic. It might be prudential, it might be moral, etc. But I think there also could be epistemic. Serendipity, again, could be an epistemic value, right? That's the whole argument on some of this literature, that it serves a crucial role in scientific discovery. So anyway, the idea here is that those trade-offs are why we're still doing ethics of AI and ethics of science and ethics of engineering, because we're gonna be bumping into these new technologies, these things that are being left behind, and these new avenues of very fruitful results, right? And at every given point, we're gonna have to ask ourselves, is it worth the trade-off?
Okay, so let me make sure that I get your answer to the question right. So one issue is, are you making the normative claim that if we automate too much, we don't realize certain kinds of, let's say, ethical values, and so that's a problem?
Or even epistemic
or is
values.
It,
yeah.
Sure, that's fine. Or is it that, as a matter of fact, AI, couldn't outpace the discoveries that we would make with something like AI plus serendipity or something like that. So that serendipity plays a sort of essential functional role in doing discoveries that we can't replace. And we would be worse off, definitely. It's just the empirical claim that you're making. We'd be definitely worse off if we deferred more to AI. Because the point here being, why should I believe that empirical claim? I'm playing the role of this data scientist. Why should I believe that empirical claim? Yeah, serendipity plays a role in scientific discovery. AI can decrease serendipity and increase overall discoveries. And let's just stipulate holding impact steady across those two scenarios. And then to put it slightly differently, insofar as this is, I know it's work in progress, I would think you'd want to push the normative claim, not just the empirical claim. Because the empirical claim is TBD, as far as I'm concerned.
Correct.
It could turn out that, holy shit, can you believe that AI just discovered A, B, and C? No way in shit humans ever would have figured that out without AI. Yeah. And wow, discovering A, B, and C, curing cancer, curing childhood defects, and whatever. We got that, and we had to decrease overall serendipity because AI took over more of the process in order to get to those massive discoveries. Okay, so that's a possible world as far as I'm concerned. That it could be that the world turns out that way. It could be the actual world, rather. So I'm not sure that you should rely on the empirical claim. We need serendipity to get the kinds of discoveries that we want, because you don't know.
Interesting.
But you could make the claim there's other kinds of ethical sacrifices not worth making, including, for instance, the sacrifice of certain epistemic virtues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really love that position, because for me, it's definitely, I have no qualms with calling for the normative claim. There's some things we ought to protect. Here's one, possible one, serendipity, right? And then I can make the case for it. But it's a normative claim. And it's not even just a sort of factual claim that is, without it, we wouldn't have X, like you said. It's not necessarily the counterfactual. It's, we want X with this being protected. And again, it's a normative of ought. So there's that one. And then the other one is, even that claim, I'm still working with this idea. The question right now is, what role does serendipity play to start with? And does it get destroyed by AI? Is it really true that it gets destroyed? Because think about what happened with AlphaGo, right? How did AlphaGo win the tournament with the world champions of Go? it won by playing something that no human would ever even consider playing, right? In fact, most of the moves were erroneous, according to the centuries of wisdom in Go had written rules and things and moves. All of those moves were actually deemed to be doomed. And AI does it and it wins the championship, right? So again, that's an instance in which it did something serendipitous. It completely blew our minds. And now we know of a completely new way to win Go, right? By just taking a risk.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I haven't studied the Go situation. I watched the documentary, but for all we know, it
Tons
was
of
just seeing a
engineers.
pattern. Yeah, it wasn't serendipitous. It wasn't like hearing the crazy man muttering in the corner. It was math. And it did some insane math that we can't do because we're too limited. And so it figured out, hey, that's the place to go next to increase the probability of winning. Yeah, you could defend the value of serendipity in one of two ways. In two ways, actually. They're compatible. One, you defend the value of serendipity in an instrumental sense. I really value serendipity because it's really useful in getting us amazing discoveries. And that's a fine way to defend it, except that it's vulnerable to the world turning out such that AI actually can make more discoveries that are more impactful, even at a sacrifice of that one tool, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that serendipity has some kind of ethical value. It speaks to what it is to be human, blah, 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 whatever the story is. And we should hold on to it, even if it results in lesser impacts. There's actually, I think, maybe a useful analogy here. I talked with a number of philosophers about what if we had AI that is better at judging humans as being guilty or not guilty? Should we then just defer to the AI? And some philosophers say, yes, we're talking about whether having an innocent person be convicted. That's terrible. We need to avoid that. If we can get more accurate AI doing the judging, then we should do that, because the whole point of deliberating about whether they're innocent or guilty is to get to the right answer. Other philosophers will say, no, I don't even care if the AI gets it more right, or rather, that can't be the overriding consideration. There's something essentially human, valuable, ethically praiseworthy, just, blah, 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 about the act of humans deliberating about the guiltiness or innocence of this person. And so even though we get worse results, the ethical value of that deliberation is not just as a means to an end of getting the right answer about whether they're innocent or guilty, but there's something inherently, intrinsically, whatever you want to call it, valuable, ethically valuable about those deliberations.
Yeah.
And so the analogy, I think, is clear with serendipity. Instead of deliberation, pop in serendipity, and you can regard it in that purely instrumental sense, and then you have these empirical objections, or you can regard it in this sort of regard serendipity as ethically valuable in the way that you might regard human deliberations about criminal defendants as ethically valuable, and say, whatever, even if AI has huge impacts, is better at discovery.
Yeah.
Would eclipse serendipity but would lead to better results overall? I'm not for that world. I'm for the world in which we value ethical serendipity, because it's essentially being human, blah, 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 whatever your story is, whatever your Kurt Vonnegutian story is.
Yeah, so there's a sense in which, for example, a lot of moral terms are like that. For example, punishment, right? That's why we cannot really hold the technology accountable, because it's just not the kind of entity that you can put in jail, that you can punish, right? It's a machine, you put it in jail, it does nothing, because it's not the kind of entity. And so it might hold also for the other side. It's not just the recipient of the punishment, it's also the person that is putting forth, holding the other person accountable, right? What's called happenstance. Happiness was also very close to the word happenstance in Latin, right? And so the idea was like, there's these things that happen that are pretty cool, but we never know them or see them or foresee them. Is there a method for us to pursue them? So there's more likelihood that the happenstance will happen, right? That was an idea from the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s that then became, one, science. Can we pursue the happening of these discoveries, right? But it even became politics. We have a whole nation based on the idea of pursuit of happiness. That comes 100% from Baconian thought, right? Can we have a method to pursue those things that just happen randomly but are pretty cool? So anyway, I just wanted to put it back into that idea that we are still on that trade-off. Is we like these random things, but can we systematize their pursuit? And if so, can we build a machine that does it for us as well, and or help us even pursue it better, right? And so again, I think that it's not just new to me. I think that this is why we do ethics, why we do philosophy, is because this question continues to be at play. These trade-offs that you were talking about continue to be at play even after 400 years of modern science.
Great. And this was super, super interesting. Thank you so much. I had thought not at all about scientific automation and serendipity. So thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks for your questions. I really enjoy the doing philosophy together. So thanks again, Reed.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Kultgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.